Thank you very much indeed, Sarah, for those overly kind words. And hello, everybody. It's such a pleasure to be here in New York, where I've been for the last week, meeting lots of people and talking to various groups, and breathing the pure air of American freedom. And I'm particularly privileged to be here today. I admire the work very much of EMET, the work that's being done. It's very necessary and obviously absolutely invaluable. And the thing that struck me over the last week that I've been here is in circles such as these. It's been about a year, I think, since I was last here. And maybe I just didn't quite pick it up when I was here about a year ago. I wasn't doing so much public speaking then, but I'm very struck by the intense anxiety that I'm now finding I've been speaking really to Jewish circles about this position of Israel in the world, and about the position of America in the world, about what's happening here, and about America's relations with Israel. And people are very bewildered because so much of it that's happening seems to be so irrational. It seems to fly in the face of demonstrable reality. And I think we're all struggling to explain this to ourselves. And I have some theories and some explanations which I want to share with you today, because I think that it's very important, if we're going to have any chance of addressing these problems. It's obviously very important that we understand them correctly. Now, the position of the figure of President Obama is clearly a very divisive one. It goes without saying that he provokes titanic passions on both sides of the political argument here, both for and against. In some quarters you can say no good of the man, and in some quarters you can say no ill whatsoever. And in Jewish circles in particular, in non-democratic voting Jewish circles, there is the most tremendous anxiety about the policy of the Obama administration towards Israel. In non-Republican Jewish circles, in democratic voting Jewish circles, there is a kind of slightly embarrassed shuffling of feet that's going on at present. But any attempt to actually address these issues by saying what's going on and what the concerns are, possibly about what's going on in such circles, meets with a complete blanking. I find that one can't criticize President Obama in those circles at all. You just don't go there. So clearly a very polarized situation which doesn't lend itself to adequate analysis, to put it mildly, of this situation. Now, my view is that to understand what's going on in this country in respect of President Obama's policy towards Israel, one has to set this in the broader context, not just of his own particular view and approach to the world, but the way in which his policy approaches reflect the most enormous changes that I would suggest have taken place over the last 20, 30 years in Western circles, particularly Western progressive circles, which have kind of infused the way the West looks at itself in the place of America, Britain and Europe in the world. And I think one can only understand what's going on in this broader context. So it's not just about Israel, it's about the world, it's not just about President Obama, it's about a whole way of thinking which has become so very influential in the West. Now, our concern about the way the West is treating Israel, particularly led by Britain, the home of the BDS movement, the home of delegitimization and demonization of Israel, a poison which has spread out. It's in Europe, it takes different forms in Europe, but I think its epicenter is Britain, and it's now spread here into your extremes, in your geographical extremes on both coasts, and in the universities. So it's not the same as it is in Britain. There are various differences we can discuss if you want, but it is here too. And it's a treatment of Israel which is marked by an obsessional malice, lies and distortions, double standards, demonization, delegitimization. Now, the people who are opposing Israel in this way always miss the bigger picture. they don't understand that Israel stands for the West, stands proxy for the West in the Middle East in two ways. Not simply because, if heaven forbid Israel were ever to go down, the West wouldn't be far behind, but because the people who are attacking Israel do so because Israel is seen as the quintessential, the Jews are seen as the people behind modernity. The people behind modernity. This is what the Islamic world is actually against. It's against modernity. It wants to stop modernity. It can see modernity coming down the tracks towards it through the internet, through social media, corrupting its young, corrupting particularly its women, by telling its women that they have a potential life beyond the confines of the Islamic world. They can't stop it. They know they can't stop it. They know the civilization is going to die as a result. So they have to stop modernity. They have to kill modernity in its tracks. And that's what it's about. That's what this war is about. And the Jews, of course, are behind everything. Read the Hamas Charter. The Jews are behind everything from the French Revolution onwards. Who would have thought we had so much power? But that's what is behind. They're behind capitalism. They're behind communism. They're behind socialism. They're behind sociology. The whole of the modern world, the Jews are behind. And to a greater or lesser extent, that's what the Islamic world believes. So that, plus the fact that Israel is the ultimate horror, because here it is, Jews controlling part of their territory. This is part of, obviously, a very important part of the picture, but it's basically an attack not just on Israel, but on the West. And this is, of course, what people in the West just don't understand. They put Israel into a kind of box marked big problem, and they don't associate that big problem with the big problem they all know they've got, which is the Islamization of Britain and Europe. They put these things in completely different boxes, and indeed, at some level, they think if only Israel would stop being horrible to the Palestinians, then all these crazes would stop hurting us. I mean, it doesn't bear examination, but that's how people are thinking. They don't understand that those threatening Israel directly threaten the West in two ways. They threaten it through terrorism, as everyone can see, through Al-Qaeda, through 9/11, and through the various Islamic splinter groups that are wreaking physical mayhem around the world. But they also, the Islamists are also attacking the West through what I would call a kind of cultural incursion through the Muslim Brotherhood, which is a global organization which is pledged to destroy the West by very, very subtle means, by cultural encroachment, slowly, year by year, moving in ways which the West finds almost impossible to fight, because to fight it would mean that you have to basically say that our culture is superior to theirs, and we won't have their culture threatening ours in the way that it does. And the West is increasingly powerless. It can't do that because it tells itself that is racism, cultural colonialism, and all the rest of it. So it's a very, very cleverly calibrated, shrewdly targeted policy, or strategy rather, based on a very wise understanding of where the West is coming from, particularly in Britain and Europe, but also elsewhere. So it's engaged on defeating modernity and its vehicle, the vehicle of modernity, which is Western civilization. And that's the sort of Sunni Al-Qaeda bit. But of course we also have Iran, which is the Shia version of this. Shia and Sunni, as we know, are at each other's throats, except when they are in each other's pockets, which is simultaneously. They both fight each other and ally with each other. And this is again what the West cannot understand, because basically both Sunni and Shia do have an ultimate project which ties them in a common bond, which is the destruction of the West. And Iran has been actively at war with the West through Iranian-sponsored terrorism since the Islamic Revolution of 1979. They told us so at the time, they told us so continuously since then, but it's not understood at all. In Britain, people are very, very frightened by the subject of Iran. They're terrified by the subject of Iran. Do you know what they're frightened about? What Britons are really, really, really losing sleep over? They're losing sleep over the fact that possibly Iran might be attacked. Possibly America or Israel might attack Iran, because then there would be war. And when you say to them, but Iran's been at war with the West since 1979, it has been behind numerous acts of terrorism, it has been blowing up British and American soldiers in Iraq through roadside bombs and all the rest of it, and it says it's going to destroy the West, and it says, by the way, it's going to destroy Israel. People don't see it like that at all. If you talk about trying to stop Iran by military means in Britain, you are deemed to be a warmonger. It's simply not understood or recognized that Iran is actually in a state of war against the West. It's the most remarkable thing, and I'm not quite sure that's quite the same here, but that's how it is in Britain. But it's all part and parcel of a wider denial of Islamic terror or incursion reality in Britain. Because the idea of the Islamic jihad itself as a religious war is thought to be completely fanciful. Among the British establishment, there is a complete denial of the fact that the jihad is a jihad, it's a religious war, and instead there is a general view that the reason for Islamic terrorism across the world is that it's a few thousand crazies who've been inflamed by grievances. It's all about grievances. Look at the grievances. There was Bosnia, that was a grievance. There's Chechnya, that's a grievance. There's Kashmir, that's a grievance. And of course, the grievance of grievances is Palestine. So the way you deal with Islamic terrorism is you solve the grievances. So you sort out these grievances, you sort out Palestine, you bring about a Palestine state, you end the grievance, and thereby you will basically draw the sting of Islamic terrorism across the world. This is, to put it mildly, an absurdity. It doesn't bear serious consideration for a minute, but believe me, that is how much of the British establishment think. And by establishment, I don't just mean politicians, I mean people in the defence world, people in the intelligence world, not all of them, but I would say the majority. That's how they think. And when you say to them, but it's a holy war, they look at you as if you are completely mad. Because to them, a holy war is something that happened in the Middle Ages. And anyway, a holy war is something they can't control. There is no end to it. It might go on for decades, centuries even. And how do you get a handle on a holy war? How can Britain deploy its great insight that when it comes to revolting natives, you divide and rule them? If it's a holy war, you can't do that. So in Britain, there is a denial of the nature of the jihad itself. So, as a result of all this, and in addition to all this, we can see that in both the United Kingdom and the United States, there is a tremendous war weariness. A weariness with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. The wars in Iraq and Afghanistan have basically taken the stuffing out of both of our countries. It's had a slightly different effect in both countries. In this country, as far as I can see, it's what I would call a real war weariness. That is to say, America went to war in good faith, thinking that it was going to achieve, mission accomplished in Iraq and in Afghanistan. It was going to be difficult, but you thought it was going to happen, and it didn't happen. It went pear-shaped. Iraq was a mess, Afghanistan was a mess. It looked as if nobody had a solution to it. A lot of blood and treasure was expended, a lot of boys died, and people here are weary of it. They just don't want to go there again because they've taken a beating. In Britain it was a bit different. In Britain, before Britain went into Iraq, it was going to be Vietnam. It was going to be Britain's Vietnam. It was going to be a quagmire. It couldn't possibly work. And Tony Blair, who took Britain into war in Iraq, was viewed as a warmonger who had needlessly exposed British boys to the risk of being killed. For what? For a solution that wasn't possible and much, much more toxic than that. He was viewed as making Britain the poodle of America. America at the time, run, as we know, by President Bush, who was president at the time. Bush was regarded as a complete lunatic. Why? Because he believed in God. He prayed. The single most damaging thing that was said about President Bush was that he prayed. He was therefore deemed to be clinically insane. And in Britain, they knew also that there was no reason to go into Iraq at all, except that that's what the Jews wanted. They knew that this was the result of a conspiracy between the Israelis and the Jews of America. The all-powerful Jews of America, who, as everyone knows, bankroll American politics and subvert American foreign policy in the interests of Israel and to the danger of the rest of the world. And that was the explanation for the war in Iraq. Even before the war in Iraq, on 9/11, you may find this hard to believe. It is so horrible, but it is true. On 9/11, there was an undercurrent, but indeed an overcurrent of opinion. On 9/11, when Iraq and Afghanistan were not even in people's minds, before people even knew about Al-Qaeda, before even people knew who had blown up the Twin Towers, as soon as it was evident that it was an act of gross terror, people looked at each other and said, Israel. They knew. They knew what the cause of this was. America's support for Israel had provoked people who were crazy to try to destroy America. And America, therefore, had it coming to it. And that was said on TV, and it reduced the American ambassador to Britain almost to tears. They had it coming to them. This was, I think, a week after 9/11. So you can see that there's an attitude in Britain which is, is not the same as the attitudes here. Anyone who supported the United States and the war in Iraq was vilified as a neocon. The word neocon was used as a code for both Jew and sinister conspirator to put the safety of the world at risk in pursuit of Jewish interests. The whole idea of American exceptionalism was regarded as synonymous. American exceptionalism was considered to be synonymous with American colonialism. America throwing its weight around the world, America doing the bidding of Washington, doing the bidding of Jerusalem. Except, of course, in Britain they don't believe that Jerusalem is the capital of Israel, but put that to one side. So when President Obama was elected, to a range of people in Britain, and I'm not just talking about people on the left, this attitude I'm describing is on left and right, because in Britain, unlike here, left and right meet without a cigarette paper between them on the issues of Israel, Middle East, American foreign policy. The left come at it from the position of America is the fount of capitalism and therefore world oppression, is therefore utterly awful. That's the left. The right come at it in Britain from the position of we don't know much about foreign affairs, we don't know much about the rest of the world, it's full of crazy people, they will leave us alone if we leave them alone. Why aren't they leaving us alone? It's because we're in alliance with America. America had it coming to it because America supports Israel. That's how that works. And so both left and right meet in the middle on this issue of America's position in the world, American exceptionalism, American foreign policy, and Israel. So when President Obama was elected, it came as a tremendous relief to many, many, many people in Britain, probably the majority. They said, at last, we have a European in the White House. At last, we have someone who thinks like us. At last, we have someone who says, I know, world, I know what America has done to you. I know, I feel your pain, and I'm going to put it better. No longer will America be the bully in the world. No longer will America be throwing its weight around the world. I will even up the score, so that the people who are oppressed by America are no longer oppressed by America. And in Britain they all went, yay, one of us, right? And that was across, as I say, the political divide. They wanted to end United States exceptionalism and these destructive wars that put them at needless risk. That was across the board. But this view in Britain was also fed by something which has leached into progressive circles in Europe, in the Western world, and into America. And this is what your analyst here, John Font, called transnational progressivism. Transnational progressivism is basically the doctrine which says the nation is the cause of the world's problems. Without the nation, you wouldn't have nationalism. Without nationalism, you wouldn't have prejudice, bigotry, exclusiveness, which leads to prejudice and bigotry, and the kind of jingoistic beliefs that lead to war. So if you want to avoid war, you have to basically avoid the nation. The idea of the nation as an expression of a particular culture rooted in a particular language, religion, history, law, literature, that's really not good. That's the way the West has kind of imposed itself upon the rest of the world. And so that has to be got rid of. Instead, we have to have the brotherhood of man. We have to have transnational institutions. What the institutions and the values that go above the nation are the truly legitimate values, the only legitimate values, because they are universal. Therefore, they don't discriminate against anybody. They are inclusive. They will produce a world community of harmony in which we no longer fight each other. We sit down and talk to each other because we're all rational. We all know that we're rational people. We are now civilized. We don't do war anymore. We do law. We pass laws which encapsulate these codes which bind us all together, these codes called human rights, international law. We do all that, and instead of fighting each other and killing each other, which is so primitive and so stupid, because as we all know, one dead body leads to another, and it doesn't really matter who started it. That's irrelevant. We all know that one dead body leads to another. Civilized, rational, intelligent people do law, not war. They do negotiation, not fighting. And above all, this is true of the West, because in the West, we don't do national self-interest anymore, because we think national self-interest is basically racist, because we in the West are people with power, and we have used that power to oppress others. So we don't do national self-interest anymore in the West. We are transnational now. And therefore, because we don't do national self-interest, we don't defend our national self-interest. We certainly don't defend it by killing people. The only wars we will do are humanitarian wars, where we can see people without power in the world who are fighting other people without power in the world, and our hearts bleed for people without power in the world, so from time to time we'll get involved in those wars to stop people without power killing other people without power, because we're humanitarian, our hearts bleed, and we're nice people, and we are decent and rational, and we don't do war anymore, we've got to stop them doing war. But as far as our national self-interest is concerned, we are not going to go to war for that, because that is bad, and that means that we might kill people who are themselves powerless. Killing just feeds a cycle of violence, and who started it is irrelevant. So, the madness of the anti-Israel prejudice is part of this attitude. I've called it in the past, I was writing specifically about Britain, and this attitude that had taken hold in Britain. And I called England, in a kind of pun, Lemmingland, on the basis that England was, well, Britain. England is a kind of synonym for Britain. It was a rather laboured pun, I do apologise. But England was basically, full of lemmings who were going over the civilizational cliff. And now I would say that the United States has to be considered to be part of Lemmingland. The West has become Lemmingland. We're going over the cliff, over the cultural cliff. We don't even know there is a cliff, let alone that we are going over it or why we are going over it. Another way of talking about it, and this is the subject of the title of one of my talks this last week, is it's a kind of political autoimmune disease, in which, an autoimmune disease, as I understand it, is basically where the body regards what is helpful to itself and gives it life as a kind of enemy, and regards what is going to kill it as a friend. And if you look at the Obama administration, that is exactly what they have done. And if you look at the wider policies of the West, that is also what they're doing, regarding, this business in Britain, regarding America as kind of the enemy, because America stands up and has stood up historically in the world to defend and protect freedom and to export real human rights. That is considered to be colonialist and bad and has to be stopped, whereas the people who actually go around killing each other, imprisoning dissidents, murdering their opponents, dealing appallingly with women, depriving homosexuals of rights and even the right to life, those people are to be considered to be victims and to be empowered, and will ignore what they do to each other. This is a complete reversal of reality and morality, and it's meant that our countries have begun treating the mortal enemies of the West as the victims of the West, while treating the West's defenders as its mortal enemies. And this is where Israel comes in. Israel is the most extraordinary situation. If you talk to people in governments in America, in Britain, and in Europe about Israel, they say Israel is our ally. Israel is our ally. We're simply critical of Israel's policies towards the Palestinians as candid friends, but of course they're our allies. Of course they're our allies. But they're simultaneously, and it's true, they're Israel's allies in one sense. In another sense, they are its mortal enemies. Because if Israel tries to defend itself by military means, it is stopped. And it is being pushed all the time into a position which is basically suicidal for itself. So it's a very strange situation where you have the ostensible allies of Israel who are simultaneously its most likely nemesis. If Israel were to listen and do what its allies are telling it to do, it wouldn't be Israel anymore. It would be destroyed. So we have a situation, for example, in the United Kingdom, the ally of Israel. I mean, the links between the United Kingdom and Israel are formidable. Trade links, for sure. Intelligence links, very, very important. Military cooperation, terribly important. It's the same in America, it's the same in Europe. Those links are very important. And in the United Kingdom, the government, the Foreign Office says the settlements are illegal. Israel is still occupying Gaza. Britain took the lead in persuading the EU to label the goods made in the disputed territories, which gave tremendous impetus to the whole delegitimization of Israel. This is Britain is Israel's ally. Both the United Kingdom and the United States have for years, and this is the most surreal thing about the negotiations between America and Britain and Europe with Israel and the Palestinians, they give the Palestinian Authority a totally free pass, while blaming Israel for jeopardizing the Middle Eastern settlement. This is completely surreal. Completely surreal. You have a set of people, the PA, forget the Hamas, you have a set of people, the PA, who are supposedly moderate, who are led by somebody who is not only himself a Holocaust denier, that was his PhD thesis, but who is presiding over an administration in which he and others say, never will we accept Israel as a Jewish state. Never. Well, that is a declaration of existential war, permanent existential war. He's presiding over an administration which is actively inciting hatred and violence against the Jewish people and against Israel through educational materials, through all the state-sponsored media and so on. His administration makes it completely clear that he is at war with Israel. As far as he's concerned, the absolute non-negotiable is the so-called right of return, which is basically not a right of return at all. It is the declared intention to swamp Israel with Arab immigrants in order to destroy the Jewish character of Israel. That's his bottom line demand, and so on and so on. Yet all of this is deemed to be completely irrelevant to the peace negotiation, and it is Israel which says, excuse me, we can't possibly tolerate this, which is then painted by America, Britain and Europe as the reason why there is no peace in the Middle East. And you go around enlightened, Jewish communities here, and you say, what is the reason why there is no peace in the Middle East? And it's Bibi. It's Bibi. How irrational is this? But you see, there's a train of thinking which leads up to this, which makes it, in its own terms, very understandable. So here you have a situation where you have John Kerry, who is threatening Israel. Astonishing situation. America, its principal ally in the world. Israel always said over the years, when asked what it was doing to counter the delegitimization movement growing in Britain and Europe, I would have these conversations with Israelis and they would say, what, do you think we're going to waste time on Britain, after what it did in Palestine? Do you think we're going to waste time on the Europeans? It's the graveyard of the Jewish people. We have America. And I would say to them, are you crazy? Are you crazy? You have the American people, for sure. But the American presidents, you look at them, it's like that over the years, and it's possible you'll lose America. And that was before President Obama. So now that we see the result, we have America. So now we have John Kerry, and John Kerry is beyond belief as a Secretary of State. I mean, I've just assembled, thanks to Yoram Ettinger, who's a great guy, He was here as an Israeli diplomat, and he now sort of produces information. So thanks to him for this information. Here are some quotes from John Kerry, referring to 2013. He said, last year, 2013, not one Israeli was killed by a Palestinian from the West Bank, he told guests at a Munich conference. This was days after the Shin Bet listed all the Israeli deaths from terror originating in 2013. We all saw the comments made by the defense minister in Israel, Moshe Ya'alon, who, in a moment, I'm sure, of unwise candor, I think he thought he was speaking off the record. He described Mr. Kerry as messianic and obsessive. Now, messianic was news to me. I didn't know he was messianic, but possibly he is. Obsessive, for sure. And in response, the United States condemned Ya'alon's comments as offensive and inappropriate. Well, offensive possibly, but inappropriate, I think not. Because it's not just vis-a-vis Israel that Mr. Kerry has displayed such egregious ignorance. And his views are really very, very suspect. Until the civil war started in Syria, Mr. Kerry was a member of a group of US senators, along with Chuck Hagel and Hillary Clinton, who believed that Bashar Assad was a generous and constructive leader, a reformer, and a man of his word. Kerry described Bashar Assad as my dear friend. In 2009, he said, Syria is an essential player in bringing peace and stability to the region. He was a fierce critic of the Bush administration's policy of hardline policy against Assad. He had advocated engagement rather than sanctions. In March 2011, he said, my judgment is that Syria will move, Syria will change as it embraces a legitimate relationship with the United States and the West. In 2012, he and others in the West, Mr. Cameron, our Prime Minister in Britain, and people in the EU, they all thought the Arab Spring was the beginning of democracy. Mr. Kerry said, what is happening in the Middle East could be the most important geostrategic shift since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And at the same time, in February 2010, Mr. Kerry told Qatari leaders that the Golan Heights should be returned to Syria and that a Palestinian capital should be established in East Jerusalem. Quote, we know that for the Palestinians, the control of Al-Aqsa Mosque and the establishment of their capital in East Jerusalem are not negotiable. Now consider that phrase, not negotiable. He's talking about people who say never will we accept Israel as a Jewish state, who incite their people to hatred and murder, and he's saying that anything they say is non-negotiable. I mean, this is so completely surreal as to be almost beyond belief. And now we can see that he is trying to bully Israel into accepting a settlement which would return it to what has been called the Auschwitz lines, the 1967 borders, and he's pressuring Israel to take that on in a situation in which the region is being convulsed, as we can all see, convulsed, and yet he is spending, I don't know, how many trips has he made on this Middle East peace process? I mean, it's obsessive is the word for it. I mean, to the exclusion of everything else. So the region is in flames around him. America is kind of retreating, of which more anon, and yet it's devoting all its attention to pressuring Israel into meeting the non-negotiable demands by people who are committed to its annihilation. I find it hard to credit this, but it's not simply towards Israel. It's that America, Britain and the EU has basically been getting everything wrong in the region. Everything wrong in the region. From the beginning of the Arab Spring, they got everything wrong. They thought it was the new dawn of democracy and human rights. Why did they think that? Because they said, look, the crowds in Tahrir Square are on Twitter. They are young. They are wearing trainers. They're on Twitter. They're just like us. They're just like us. And so, get rid of Mubarak, and we'll have the Paris of the Middle East. That's what they thought. That's what they thought. They never understood that the toppling of bad men, and Mubarak was a bad man, was a bad thing. If you were toppling a bad man who was either useful to or contained by the West, if you replaced him by a bad man, or even a worse man, who was not useful to and not contained by the West, but was determined to destroy the West, that would actually be a bad thing. This idea that, you know, which Israel faces all the time, they're between a rock and a hard place. The choice is not between good and bad. There are no good choices, none. It's between a bad choice, a worse choice, and a really suicidal choice. They're the choices, and they're the choices of the Middle East. You have bad people, you have bad regimes, you have bad people being replaced by not good people, worse people. The Western mind can't get itself around that, because the Western mind is basically racist, it is basically culturally colonialist. It says the world is governed by reason, just like us. The world is composed of people just like us. All cultures are the same as each other, all cultures are like us, all cultures are like ours. Everyone's governed by their own self-interest. All you have to do is get people in a room, talking to each other, and they'll sort everything out. So you had the support of the removal of Colonel Gaddafi. Colonel Gaddafi was not a good man, he was a dreadful man. But we've seen what's happened as a result of the removal of Colonel Gaddafi. We've seen chaos, the rise of jihadi groups in Libya, weapons caches that have gone missing, weapons being smuggled from Libya to the Hamas. In Egypt, we saw President Mubarak, bad man, replaced by the Muslim Brotherhood, committed to human rights. They were not, and amazingly enough, the Egyptians also thought this was a really bad thing, and the Egyptians, as we could see, were repelled by the Brotherhood and terrified by the Brotherhood to such an extent that they took to the streets in their millions to denounce President Obama for helping put the Brotherhood in power. And they helped put into power the strongman Sisi to keep the Brotherhood out of power forever. A fact which so displeased the Obama administration. They have, as we can see, threatened Sisi and carried out to some extent the threat to withdraw the kind of military help they gave to Egypt, because as far as the Obama administration was concerned, the Brotherhood was the key player they wanted to see entrenched in the Middle East, because there are good Islamists and there are bad Islamists, and the Brotherhood are good Islamists because we can control them and they are on our side. I mean, this is but completely crazy. So at every stage in this hapless process, I mean, forget for a moment the part played by the United Kingdom and Europe, because they're basically all on the same kind of page in this madness. But the most important player is America, because America has to be the sole guarantor of peace and liberty in the world. And once America retreats from that position, the world is in a very dangerous place indeed. And at every stage, the Americans' administration, the Obama administration, has been advertising its powerless and helplessness in the Middle East, with the result that those so-called allies of ours in the Middle East, such as Saudi Arabia, I say so-called because, you know, it's like dealing with a snake. I mean, it can't really be considered an ally, but nevertheless, relatively speaking, those states in the Middle East which were reasonably reasonable and saw America and the West as a kind of ally, have concluded that they cannot rely on America at all to do anything. And they are then cozying up, it's called the strong horse theory. They go with the strong horse. If America is no longer going to be the strong horse in the region, they go for the next strong horse. The strong horse is Iran. And so they are simultaneously moving to fight and contain Iran while cozying up to Iran. It's a catastrophic situation because one of the results is that Iran has become hugely strengthened in the region. And this is because America has withdrawn its role as the policeman of liberty in the world. And we can see the havering and the hopelessness of it. In Syria, President Obama said, my red line is over their use of chemical weapons. They used chemical weapons. Suddenly the red line disappeared. He did nothing. And he hesitated, and then he provided ineffectual assistance to the rebels. Was he for the rebels? Was he against the rebels? He didn't know. No one knew. Everyone could see American administration hadn't got a clue. Now, it's bad enough for us in Britain or the rest of the West looking at America thinking, oh my God, how can we be defended if America is so pathetic? But for the region, it's worse than disastrous because the strong, bad people like Iran become absolutely empowered by this. They look at Obama, they say, this man will never be a threat to us, and then they can make hay with it, as we can see in the context of the nuclear negotiations, because Iran is the most egregious example we can have at the moment of empowering the mortal enemy of the West. This idea that President Rouhani was a moderate is completely ridiculous. He himself has boasted of how, when he was the chief nuclear negotiator of Iran, I think back in the 80s, he pulled the wool over the eyes of America and the West by pretending to be a reformer, whereas in fact all he was doing was buying time for the nuclear program to advance. He has said it in terms, no one took any notice of it, and now he has been elected president in order to sanitize Iran. Anyone with half a brain can see that this is a nonsense. Anyone who knows anything about Iran knows that there's only one person who matters in Iran. It's not President Rouhani, it's the supreme leader. He's the only person who matters. Anyone who knows anything about Iran knows that they remain committed to what they've always been committed to since 1979, which is the defeat of the West and the annihilation of Israel. And we can also see that this deal is transparently worthless. I say we can see it's transparently worthless. We can see it's transparently not transparent because we've not actually been allowed to see the wretched deal. What sort of a situation is this? Why aren't we allowed to see it? Because we are not being allowed to see it because of the fear of what we will see when we do see it. So when Iran says this deal allows us, in terms, to achieve nuclear capacity, whatever the word is, to complete our nuclear program, which of course is for peaceful purposes. The very thing that the West has been sworn can never happen. It's impossible for it to happen. I heard this over and over again over the years. We cannot allow Iran to go nuclear because we don't trust it. We understand that it's building a nuclear weapon. It's not for peaceful purposes. It cannot achieve nuclear breakout. This deal allows it to achieve nuclear breakout. It's as simple as that. And when Iran says, it's over folks, we've won, they are telling the truth. They are crowing for a reason. They have won. And this is an astonishing situation. So, why has all this happened? Well, it's a very long story, and I'm going to take it very briefly, because I think it's very important to understand that we're not dealing here with a rogue president. We're not dealing here with a president who's come from nowhere with some view of the world which he's imposing upon America. There is an element to that, which I'll come to in a moment. But I think it's very important if we are ever going to deal with this, and as far as I can understand it, your Republican Party here isn't sounding the most certain note about dealing with President Obama, and hasn't got the most coherent idea of its own foreign policy aspirations. It's very important to understand this is not just Obama. It's very important to understand where this is coming from, because where it's coming from is a view of the West, and a view of life in the West, and of the West's values, which has to be understood if we are ever going to get on top of this. I talked about transnational progressivism, and it really is sort of, a lot of it is to do with that. It's a culture which started with this idea that no culture, no set of people, no lifestyle could be said to be superior to any other. And this took the form of, lifestyle choice in family relations, the privatization of morality, radical egalitarianism of lifestyle. So majority rules of behavior were then intrinsically suspect as exclusive, prejudiced, or oppressive. You couldn't have moral judgments between different lifestyles of behavior. And as a result, as I said before, the nation itself became suspect because the nation was the embodiment of majority identity, which by definition treated everything that wasn't majority, i.e. all minorities, as lower in the cultural hierarchy. It had to. So the idea of a nation which represents and protects individual citizens on the basis they all subscribe equally to an overarching identity and set of values came to be replaced as the key driver by a set of groups fighting each other over race, religion, ethnicity, gender, or whatever, however they defined themselves. They were fighting each other. And democracy became redefined from majority rule among equal citizens to power sharing among ethnic and other interest groups. Multiculturalism became the orthodoxy of the day, along with non-judgmentalism, and the only taboos were the expression of normative majority values, and the only legitimate values, as I've said, were now universal, detached from the particulars of religion, tradition, or nation, multinational, transnational values. So the nation-state came to be seen as past its sell-by date. The remedy was transnational progressivism. Laws based on the values, traditions, and histories of nations had to be replaced by laws and delivery mechanisms that were universal. So international law trumped the laws passed by sovereign states, and human rights trumped their cultural values. So we have supranational laws and values imposed by supranational institutions, such as the European Court of Human Rights, the European Union, the United Nations, the International Criminal Court. These have become seen as the sole sources of legitimacy. And one further development from that was this, that law, as I've said before, law trumped other forms of human interaction, including war. The application of law would settle all the world's problems and conflicts. It was law that, by regulating behaviour and attitudes, would bring about a new and uplifted universal psyche, codifying the principles to which all civilized people could sign up, would, it was thought, eradicate hatred, impose global order, and remove any occasion for war. In addition, with the fall of communism, the left, the progressive side of the political divide, needed a new utopian project. They had to find a new radical motif to replace communism or socialism that would enable them to continue their defining mission to transform society and human nature. And so the left, progressives, turned their attention to the far less visible and more slow-burning culture war, the areas of family, education, multiculturalism at home, anti-colonialism, anti-racism abroad. Humanitarianism became the norm. We had to end oppression, end world poverty. That was the cause. Minorities were all good, majorities were all bad. Anti-racism meant that minorities, people without power, were seen as victims given a free pass for their behaviour. And this way of thinking took us from, as I've said, from war to law. And as a result, this idea of the peace process became almost sacrosanct. The idea of negotiation became sacrosanct. It has driven me absolutely potty, this way in which to uphold this belief that negotiation is always the way forward. Various things are being prayed in aid which are simply historically nonsensical. So, for example, South Africa. We all know what happened in South Africa. It was a peaceful transition from minority apartheid rule to majority black rule. And this was true. It was true that the majority black people did not go down the path of revenge. They went down the path of reconciliation, and it was a peaceful and harmonious passage in which apartheid, the evils of apartheid, were defeated without a shot being fired. Let's pass over the fact that there was terrorism in the process, but basically that's what happened. It wasn't a civil war, and everybody breathes a great sigh of relief. Take Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland had a peace process presided over by Tony Blair. Tony Blair went around the world telling everybody this was the paradigm to solve the Middle East crisis and every other crisis, because the lion lay down with the lamb. The lion lay down with the lamb. Here you had the Protestants and Catholics beating seven hells out of each other for decades, hatred of each other entrenched, just like the Palestinians and the Israelis. And lo and behold, the Catholic IRA, put down their weapons, came into the democratic process, sat down with their mortal enemies on earth, the Protestants, and look what happened. They talked to each other, they formed a government, there is no more killing, and everything is absolutely fine. And that is the peace process. And that is how the world solves its problems, through reconciliation, through peace processes. Now, this is so completely and utterly wrong. South Africa did not end apartheid through reconciliation. It ended it through very profound geopolitical changes, of which I would suggest the fall of communism was an extremely important factor. When the white minority suddenly, and de Klerk had said this, we said to ourselves, we are no longer worried that the ANC is going to impose a communist, going to make this a communist country. Communism is over. So that was very important. You know, I mean, the reconciliation came later, but that wasn't why apartheid ended. In Northern Ireland, the IRA came into the peace process because it wanted to come into the peace process because it had been defeated militarily by the British Army. It had not not sort of surrendered, but the British Army had, through a combination of its military activities against the IRA, and even more important, its infiltration, so that it was riddled with informers to the very top. The IRA knew it was beaten. It could never win through terrorism. It knew it could, the military option was over. The only way it could ever achieve its ends was by using the democratic process. So it came into a peace process. Now, the thing about peace processes is this. Once you start them, you cannot end them, because you cannot go to war. The definition, the assumption is that war is simply a bad thing. You cannot go to war. You have to replace war by law. You have to replace war by negotiation. It's a bit like interfaith dialogue. Once you start it, you cannot admit to anything that's going to stop it. So, in Northern Ireland, the peace process could not be interrupted by such inconvenient truths as the IRA have not got rid of their weapons. We just don't know where they are. That's different. We're letting out thousands or hundreds, whatever it was, of murderers who might actually continue to do terrible things. Can't even admit that. Can't even admit that. And we see this now in the Middle East. We have a peace process. The peace process is sacrosanct. Only through the peace process can there be a solution, because the only solution can come from everyone sitting around a table and negotiating with each other. So the fact that Mahmoud Abbas is still recruiting, as it were, or is still presiding over acts of terror through whatever they're called, I forgot what it's called, the terrorist wing of the Fatah, who are actually killing Israelis, the fact that he's actually inciting his children to hatred and murder, the fact that he says, I will never accept Israel as a Jewish state, we aren't even going to go there. We're going to deny it. We're going to deny it. Because if we were to accept that, it would mean that the peace process would be a farce. It would mean that we were actually conniving at the unconscionable giving of victims over to people who are trying to make them, who are trying to exterminate them. We can't accept that, so we have to deny it. And instead we'll blame the Israelis, because the Israelis are saying stuff which could stop the peace process, like, you know what? They're continuing to try to kill us. That could stop the peace process. And the peace process cannot be stopped. So this business of war to law, which has been considered axiomatically civilized behavior. We don't do war anymore. Killing leads to a cycle of killing. It is stupid, it is counterproductive, it doesn't solve anything. We never solve anything by killing anybody, ever. That's the belief. Instead, we're civilized, we're educated, we do war, we do law, not war, we do negotiation. This is leading directly to lies, injustice, and more war. It must lead to lies because you have to deny the truth. It must lead to injustice because you are giving to people who are aggressing. And it must lead to war because ultimately the victims will not stand for it. Ultimately, Israel has to defend itself by military means. It has no other choice. So we have a situation where, through a combination of ignorance, arrogance, and funk, we have a situation in which the countries of the West are really turning against their own interests. And these are deep cultural changes which have happened in our society, which I think need to be understood if we are going to actually pull ourselves back as a West, as an America, as a Britain, as a Europe, and start defending our society. We have to, first of all, know what it is we're defending and why. And secondly, we have to understand how we have to defend these values. We have to understand that the modern obsession with never going to war leads us inescapably down the path of appeasement, down the path of kowtowing to terror, down the path of injustice, and down the path of, much worse than injustice, the destruction of innocent people. And that's the direct result of this whole way of thinking. And until we understand that's the way of thinking, then we're not going to get to the bottom of this. But there are also reasons that are particular to President Obama. Now, I think President Obama is a complicated character, and I think that people don't understand, because he's so polarizing and because so many of us know kind of where he's come from, we don't take into account this element of President Obama that I've just been described. Because President Obama is, to a very large extent, a man of the left, a man of the progressive side of politics. These attitudes that I'm describing to you in some detail are encapsulated by him. This is why Britain, when President Obama was elected, Britain said, he's one of us, thank goodness. He understands, he's civilized. He's not going to be crude and go around killing people because he's American and because he can just throw his power around just like President Bush and start bombing people from a height of a million miles. He understands that we are now in a different and civilized world because he has a European way of thinking, which is he's a professor and he understands that you do thinking, you do talking, you do negotiation. He's one of us. And to a certain extent, to a large extent, that is true. He is. You can see that's where part of him is coming from. And that's bad enough. That's bad enough. But then, I believe, overlaying all of that is a particular view of the world, which he has, which comes, in my view, and I don't know, I've never met the man, but I've read a lot of what he has written, and I've watched him rise, and I've written about this since he first emerged onto the scene as a possible presidential candidate. I looked at all his associations from his childhood onwards, and one should never judge someone by their childhood because people change, but the point about President Obama, he didn't change. There was no change in the kind of people he mixed with, the kind of friends he adopted, the kind of values he espoused. And it all seemed to me was a resentment against the world of the powerful over the world of the powerless, the world of white people over the world of black people. And it seemed to me that he wanted to even up the score. It's very personal to him, to even up the score between the West and the rest. And part of that is fueled by what I've just been talking about, which is a progressive view in which they all agree that the West stands for power and the rest stand for powerless, and you have to even up the score. But with President Obama, it seems to me it's infused by something in addition from his personal background and from the very radical circles in which he has consistently moved and from which he has drawn his friends. These radical circles have a visceral hatred of and hostility towards Western values, Western culture, and that's basically where he is coming from. And it is a terrible thing that he has cozied up. America's new best friend is Iran. Iran, which is the unconscionable enemy of the West. But there's a further point about the Obama administration, which was apparent to me from the very start, because it's even more complicated. It's not simply that President Obama surrounded himself by people who came from his kind of progressive background or more radical background. They didn't just come from progressive circles, so I would call like soft left, we call it in Britain. They didn't just come from more radical elements, which are his personal friends who are continuously advising him. We understand that to be the case. But he also put into his circle people who I think are called realists, who come from the right. And these realists, I don't really know why they're called realists, but I think it's because they have what seemed at one point to be a very sensible view of the world, which is that you're pragmatic in foreign policy. You try and achieve an equilibrium, a balance of power. And if you listen to President Obama, he often talks this language. He wants a balance between Israel and the Arabs. He wants to achieve that balance. He thinks he can achieve that balance. He wants to achieve a balance between Iran and the West. He understands the problem with Iran, but he wants to achieve a balance because that's what sensible people do. They achieve an equilibrium. And then you don't have to do anything horrible like war. You keep the equilibrium going because you're clever, you're smart. You divide and rule. That's the whole point. That's realism. But it's not realistic at all, because there are people now in the world, maybe there always were, but there certainly are now, for whom there can be no equilibrium, because there can be no negotiation, because there is no compromise, because their position is simply non-negotiable. As the Hezbollah said, we love death, you love life. It's us or you, and we're going to win. And that's what we're up against. And that's what President Obama and his liberal colleagues, his realist colleagues, cannot understand. They don't understand that there are some people for whom the agenda is non-negotiable. So in conclusion, what are the consequences of all this? What are the consequences of the Obama administration's foreign policy? Well, basically, he has empowered bad people and increased the threat to the vulnerable. He's empowered Iran above all other dangerous entities at present, because it's the most, in my view, the single most dangerous of all entities. He's empowered them, and he's empowered the people who kind of flow swim in their slipstream, and he has made he'll help bring about a state of chaos in the Middle East and the wider Middle Eastern region. But he's astonishingly upset, I think, virtually every single ally that America has, even the Chinese. He's upset over Japan. I mean, it's extraordinary. I mean, virtually everybody who has ever been any kind of ally of the West is in a state of high dudgeon or worse. And the unconscionable enemies of the West find themselves empowered. He has removed America from its historic and supremely important role as the world's single most important guarantor and protector of Western civilization. He's left a vacuum. He's left a vacuum. And into that vacuum, as we can see, have come Russia and China. Russia, President Putin, posing as the savior of Western civilization, the defender of the West. It was Putin who brokered the deal with Syria, by which Syria was supposed to get rid of its chemical weapons, a deal which we now know has mysteriously evaporated. How surprising is that? But he was able to strut around and say, look, I'm the person who is doing this deal. America has removed itself from this role. We see Mr. Putin, who has supported General Sisi in Egypt. Off he went, shook him by the hand. Sisi is now getting his weapons from Russia. How clever is that? China, somebody was telling me the other day, China is moving into Egypt big time in terms of, I don't know, producing some scheme for, is it railways or some major infrastructure development. China and Russia are in Egypt. How clever is that? America has been replaced by China and Russia in Egypt. Egypt is a supremely important country, geopolitically speaking, from all points of view. It is so important for the West to be in Egypt. That's why we supported Mubarak, not because Mubarak was a good man, not because we thought he encapsulated Western values, because Egypt is crucial to the defense and security of the Western world. And now Egypt is in the hands of Russia and China. This is beyond madness. In conclusion, finally, I would say this. In Britain, and I see here, in circles here, a lot of people are very, very concerned about President Obama's foreign policy, and including people who are his supporters, who believe in all his domestic program, they believe in Obamacare and all his social liberalism. That's all great, and anybody who talks about Obama sort of, in introducing a kind of state-run oppression of the American people is out to lunch. They believe all that, but they're very concerned about foreign policy because they can see that America is being laughed at. They can see Putin strutting around, laughing at America. They even see Iran laughing at America. They don't like it. And so they say, and I hear this in Britain a lot, oh, Obama, he's just so disappointing, so disappointing. He's just clueless. The man doesn't have a clue. He's so incompetent. He's surrounded by absolute fools. He doesn't know what he wants to do in the world. Somebody said that recently. Somebody quite, I've forgotten who it was. It was, oh, I know who it was. It was, I think it was, he's a professor of war studies. And he said, the problem with President Obama is that he hasn't got a clue about what he wants the world to look like. Well, I think this is all wrong. I don't think he's clueless. I think cluelessness is a hallmark of his administration, but then cluelessness often follows from an ideological perspective that is basically not rooted in reality. I think he knows exactly what he wants to do with the world. Mm-hmm. I think he's done exactly what he set out to do in the beginning, which was to increase the power of the state at home and to reduce the power of America abroad. And I think he's done that. But to say that he's therefore isolationist, which a lot of people also say, the problem with America has become so terrifyingly isolationist, well, that's not quite true either, because if you look at what Mr. Kerry is doing in the Middle East, it is far from isolationist. It is so interventionist as to be obsessive, as has been said. So it is not quite true to say it's isolationist. And if you look at the part played by the Obama administration, along with Britain and the EU, in the removal of President Mubarak, in the removal, in the installation of the Muslim Brotherhood, in the removal of Colonel Gaddafi, this is not isolationism. This is actually actively intervening on the part of bad men against Western interests. So isolationism doesn't quite get it. The fact remains, the West needs the United States to protect it and to defend the issue of freedom, the value of freedom against its adversaries. Unfortunately, at the moment, we have an administration here, your administration here, where the opposite has been put in place and where your opposition party, the Republican Party, has not yet found a voice, a means to oppose it. And I would suggest that if the Republican Party is ever to find its voice, to work out quite how to deal with this, it has to actually know what it stands for. It has to know what its foreign policy strategy is about. And in order to do that, it has to understand the kind of things that I've been trying to explain to you today. It has to understand that it's not just up against this appalling person called President Obama who has taken over the White House and is doing such damage. That's part of the argument, I'm sure, but it's not the whole argument, because behind President Obama is Hillary. And if you think Hillary's got different views, they are different. She's a different person. She doesn't have Obama's background, and she has her own thing. But, you know, we're talking about a tide of thinking that, in my view, has taken over the Democratic Party. It's taken over progressive thinking, not just here, but in Britain and in Europe. It's all these things I'm talking about. The nation is a bad thing. The West is a bad thing. The West is powerful. Power is bad. People and nations with power can never do good. People without power can never do bad. We must never do war. We must never kill anybody. We must never kill anybody with a brown or black face. We must always talk to people. And the talking is sacred. And nothing can be allowed to stop the talking. And if that means that we have to talk with people who are saying, and I am going to kill you as soon as I finish talking to you, we just have to carry on talking to them. Because we can't hear that. Because the talking is what matters, and nothing else matters. And until and unless the Republican Party here, the conservative movement in Britain, and all people across the world who really do understand the difference between right and wrong, really do understand the difference between victim and aggressor, really do understand the difference between lies and truth, until people like us understand, not only understand those things, but understand why and where and how they've been turned upside down and inside out, then we're not going to get anywhere. We have to understand all these things if we are to succeed against this terrible thing that's taken over our societies.